The car isn't yours yet. You're parked behind a restaurant at 11:43 at night, and your hands still smell like dish soap and old grease. The kind that doesn't fully wash off anymore because your skin has accepted it as permanent. You made $63 today, before taxes. And you're sitting in the dark with a folded piece of paper on your lap, numbers you calculated in your head between plates, and you're staring at it like it's evidence of something you don't have a name for yet. Here's what nobody tells you in that moment, that ceiling you keep bumping your head against. It's not failure, it's not laziness, it's not even poverty, it's psychology. It was built before you were born. It was wired into you before you could speak. And most people, live their entire lives inside it, without ever once looking up and realizing it's there. This is the story of what happens when someone finally does. Chapter 1. You don't learn about money from school. You learn it from rooms, from the specific way your mother's shoulders dropped every time the phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. Because unknown numbers meant one thing back then. They meant someone wanted something you didn't have. You learn it from the sound of the mail slot, from the way she moved faster through the kitchen when the heat bill was due. Like, if she kept moving, the number at the bottom of the envelope couldn't catch her. You were 6 years old, and already fluent in a language nobody taught you. The language of financial anxiety. Read from body language, from silence, from the rhythm of voices changing in the last week of the month. Your father said it exactly once. You were 9. You asked why you couldn't go on the school trip to Washington, D.C. He said, "We came to this country with $340 and 2 suitcases. Not like a story, like a number on a bill. Flat. Final the trip cost $47. You didn't go, and in that moment, without anyone explaining it, you understood something that would shape every financial decision you'd make for the next 2 decades. Money wasn't something your family managed. It was something your family survived. The emergency fund in your house was a Maxwell House coffee tin with a red lid pushed to the back of the cabinet above the refrigerator. You had to stand on a chair to reach it, inside. Rolled bills, rubber banded, a few coins loose at the bottom, no interest, no growth, no plan. Just cash sitting in the dark, waiting for something to go wrong, and something always went wrong. The car, the tooth, the landlord's new policy, the tin would come down, the bills would come out, and for the next few days the air in the apartment felt thinner. Like everyone was breathing a little more carefully until it was replenished. That is what you understood money to be, not a tool, not an asset, not something that grows while you sleep, a buffer. Between you and the next bad thing. Here's what's devastating about this. Right now, the average American household keeps less than $1,000 in liquid savings. Your family wasn't behind the curve. Your family was the curve, the median, the norm. That's the part nobody tells you when you're 9 years old standing on a chair to reach the coffee tin. The ceiling above you isn't your family's failure. It's a structure, built long before you arrived, shared by more people than you'll ever meet, invisible to everyone inside it, because when you grow up inside something, it just feels like the sky. Psychologists call this a financial schema, an unconscious mental model of what money is, what it does, and what you're allowed to do with it. These schemas aren't formed from instruction. They're formed from observation, from rooms, from the specific sound of a refrigerator door opening and closing too slowly by someone counting what's left. You didn't choose this ceiling. You were born inside it. For a long time, it just felt like the sky. Chapter 2. You are 19 years old. You are standing at a prep station in the back of a diner in Queens called Rosa's, scraping plates into a gray bin. And the smell of dish soap and old grease is so permanent on your skin that you don't notice it anymore. 11 on an hour. $44 after taxes on a 6-hour shift. You know this number the way you know your own name. But somewhere between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, something shifts. The owner, a man named Dale, moves through the dining room with a particular kind of ease. And it has nothing to do with personality. It's the ease of someone who knows exactly what every table is worth. You watch him from the kitchen window. Not consciously, not with any plan. Just watching. And your mind, without being asked, starts doing what it's always done. Food cost per plate, roughly 30% of the menu price. Labor running 28, maybe 29% on a busy morning. The margins aren't wide, but they exist, and they belong to Dale, not to you. You fold that observation into the same pocket as everything else you can't do anything with yet. Then you go home and you can't sleep. Not because you're angry, because something has been Disturbed that can't be undisturbed. You pick up your cracked phone screen at 1 a.m. while your roommate sleeps 6 feet away. You start reading anything. Everything business models, markups. How much does a website cost to build versus how much someone will pay for one? You read about a guy who started a pressure washing business with a $200 used machine and cleared $4,000 in his first month. The average side hustle earns an American worker an extra $810 a month. You read that number and immediately think, I don't want average. I want the thing Dale has, the room that works while I'm not watching it, so you save, quietly. Shift after shift after shift, $1,000 in a checking account. You tell no one, then you spend it. A basic website, a business license, a logo from Fiverr, a Google ad that runs for 10 days and produces exactly 0 clients, $1,500, gone in less than 2 weeks. You check the account on a Thursday morning, $23.07, and your chest does something specific, not panic. Something quieter and worse than panic. The particular feeling of having tried, and having the world say nothing back. Here's what psychology tells us about this moment. Most people experience their first major financial failure as, confirmation of what the coffee tin always implied. That risk leads to loss, that trying leads to humiliation, that the ceiling is there for a reason. This is called learned helplessness, a term coined by psychologist Martin Seligman after studying subjects who stopped trying to escape painful situations, even when escape became possible, because they'd been conditioned to believe their actions didn't matter. The invisible ceiling doesn't just limit your income, it limits your imagination of what's possible after failure. But here's what you did that Thursday morning with $23.17 in your account. You went back to Rosa's on Friday, you scraped the plates, you watched Dale move through the dining room, and you did not quit. That's the thing nobody marks with a ceremony, not the losing, the staying, the way you absorb a loss that size, at that age, on that income, and refuse to let it become the last sentence of your story. You just went back. You kept reading, you kept counting, and slowly, without announcing itself, the long middle began. Chapter 3. The long middle doesn't announce itself, it just keeps being Tuesday. The mattress you're sleeping on cost $180 from a guy who posted it on Facebook Marketplace with one blurry photo and the description, barely used. You carry it up 3 flights with a guy from down the hall you barely know because you don't have anyone else to call. You set it on the floor because the bed frame is next month's problem. You lie down at 11 p.m. and you're back up at 6 a.m. And in between, you read everything you didn't finish reading the night before. This is what the grind actually looks like, not a montage, not a highlight reel. A $180 mattress on a floor in Astoria, and a cracked phone screen, and the specific discipline of doing the same invisible thing tomorrow that you did today, with no one watching and no one asking how it's going. The invitation stopped gradually. You don't notice the exact moment. One Sunday you realize the group chat hasn't said your name in 6 weeks. Nobody cut you off. Nobody had a conversation about it. You just became someone who isn't available, and eventually, people stop reaching for someone who isn't there. The social math is crueler than the financial math. When you lose $1,500, you know exactly what you lost. When you lose a group of people who knew you before all of this, there's no number. You just feel it on Friday nights when your phone is quiet and you're reading about LLC tax structures instead. By 22, you're building websites for small businesses from that Astoria apartment, a bodega owner in Jackson Heights, a woman who runs a cleaning service in the Bronx, a barbershop in Flatbush that needed to show up on Google. You charge $800 a site, then $2,200, then $2,000. When you realize the work is exactly the same, and the only thing that changed was what you believed it was worth. This is one of the most important psychological discoveries any self-made person makes. Brees is not cost plus margin. Price is a story about your own perceived value, and most people from households like yours have been trained to underprice themselves their entire lives. Because asking for more always carried risk. Because the tin could always run out. Because staying small felt safer than the exposure of claiming your worth. Changing that belief doesn't happen in a moment. It happens in a conversation. In a number you type into an invoice, and then delete and retype higher, and then delete again, and then finally send before you can talk yourself out of it, and the client says yes, and something in the ceiling cracks. By 24, you are running a small digital agency. 3 freelancers on Slack, a monthly retainer model, 12 clients, $400 to $900 each, depending on what they need, total, $60s $800 a month. You do the math on a Tuesday afternoon, then you do it again, because the first time didn't feel real. The median household income in the United States sits just under $80, zeros and a year. You are making that, alone. From a desk wedged between the kitchen and the window in an apartment where the radiator still knocks every night at 2 a.m. Nobody congratulates you. There isn't. You transfer the money, you pay your freelancers, you send the invoices, and you open the next problem. That's all it is. The work, and then more work, and the slow compound of showing up when it would have been easier not to. Chapter 4/28, the agency has become something else entirely. Software, a product. Recurring revenue that doesn't require you to bill by the hour anymore. $3.1 million annually, a number that still doesn't feel like it belongs to you when you see it on a screen. That's the year a venture capital firm calls. They want to meet. They have a number in mind, $4 million. For 16% of what you built. You sit across the table from 2 men in a conference room in Midtown. You listen, and you think about Dale's dining room, about your mother's shoulders, about the tin, and you say no. That no is where the quiet crossing begins. The moment the grind stops being about survival and starts being about something you don't yet have a word for. That no doesn't feel like power at first. It feels like the specific vertigo of having turned down more money than your parents will earn in the next 20 years combined, based on a feeling you can't fully articulate to anyone, including yourself. 6 months later, the software crosses $10. 1 million in annual recurring revenue without you billing a single hour. You are 31 years old. You are sitting at the same desk, between the kitchen and the window. The radiator is still knocking, and your phone shows a number that doesn't fit inside the life currently surrounding it. You check it again. Same number. You put the phone face down on the desk and sit there for a moment, doing nothing, which is something you haven't done in years. This is not what arriving looks like in the movies. There is no soundtrack, no slow exhale, no confetti, just a Wednesday morning, a knocking radiator, and a number on a screen that has quietly outgrown everything around it. Here's what nobody prepares you for when the money gets real. The old problems dissolve so fast you barely notice them going. The radiator, the mattress. The question of whether you can cover next month. Gone. And in their place, immediately, without pause, a completely different set of problems arrives. In a language nobody prepared you for, an accountant calls and uses the phrase pass-through entity taxation. A lawyer mentions a revocable trust, and for the first time since you were 9 years old, standing on a chair to reach the coffee tin, you are back in a room where everyone else knows something you don't. Research shows that only about 34% of Americans have any estate planning documents at all. The other 66%, and until 8 weeks ago you, are operating without a map in territory where getting it wrong has real consequences. You get something wrong almost immediately. You take a distribution from the business without setting aside self-employment tax. The bill arrives $47,000. You pay it. You don't sleep well for 4 nights. Not because you can't cover it, but because you didn't see it coming. And not seeing it coming means there are other things you're not seeing, and you don't yet know what they are. That is the specific texture of new money that nobody talks about. It's not celebration. It's competence without context. The vertigo of knowing how to build something, having built it, and then discovering that inhabiting what you built requires an entirely different education. One nobody offered you. One you're going to acquire in real time, at real cost. Chapter 5. You pick up the phone to call your mother. You want to tell her the number. You hold the phone. You think about how you would begin that sentence, and you put it down. Not because you don't want to share it, because the sentence doesn't exist yet. The language between you was built for a different set of problems, and this one doesn't translate. Your cousin calls on a Tuesday night. There's a thing with his landlord. He needs $2,200 by Friday, or he's out. He doesn't ask directly. He just describes the situation in enough detail that the ask is obvious and then goes quiet. And the quiet is the question. You say yes. You send it that night. And something in the room changes, not between you specifically, but in some larger architecture of what you are to each other now. You are no longer the same species of person, navigating the same species of problem. You are something else, and both of you feel it. And neither of you says it. Your best friend from high school, Jerome, stops calling the way he used to. The calls get shorter, the texts less frequent. You used to talk every Sunday about nothing, about everything, the way you do with someone who has known you since before you knew yourself. Then one Sunday you realize it's been 6 weeks. You text him. He responds warmly enough. But the warmth has the quality of effort now, of maintenance, like tending to something neither of you is sure still grows. You don't know how to fix it because you don't know what broke, and nothing did break. That's the harder truth. You just moved, slowly, without announcing it, into a different room. And the distance isn't hostility, it's just distance. The kind that accumulates when two people's daily realities stop overlapping, and the overlap was most of what you talked about. You go home for Thanksgiving. Your aunt makes the same food in the same kitchen. Some football game plays in the background. On the surface, completely unchanged. But you sit at that table knowing something nobody else at it knows, and the knowing is its own kind of alone. Your uncle makes a joke about rich people. Everyone laughs. You laugh too, a half beat late, because you needed that half beat to decide which version of yourself is sitting in this chair. Research on sudden wealth consistently identifies relationship disruption as the primary source of psychological distress for high earners from working class backgrounds. More than the financial complexity, more than the legal learning curve, the money is manageable, the people are not, and you are not losing anyone. That's what makes it so difficult to name. Jerome is still there, your cousin is still there, your aunt is still cooking in the same kitchen, now body left. They are just becoming, slowly without intention, people you used to be the same as, and you are grieving something that has no funeral, no moment, no clean before and after. You keep going home, you keep showing up, you keep sending what people need when they need it, you keep laughing a half beat late at the jokes about people like you, and you keep carrying the distance like a coat you can't take off inside the house. You are 47 years old. You are sitting in a 9-year-old Lexus in your own driveway, engine off, garage door open, and you have not gone inside yet. A woman from Forbes called 40 minutes ago to verify a number. Standard procedure, she said. The number she confirmed, $1, 84 billion. You sit with that for 6 minutes, not celebrating, not crying, just sitting, the way you used to sit on the floor of that Astoria apartment in the specific quiet of a thing finally being over. Except nothing is over. You think about the coffee tin with the red lid. You think about your father saying 300 centers, like it was a verdict. You think about Dale moving through the dining room with that particular ease. The folded piece of paper, the $23, 17 on a Thursday morning. The Midtown conference room and the two men and the no that felt like jumping off something without being able to see the bottom. The $1.84 billion, it doesn't erase any of it. It doesn't explain any of it. It just sits on top of all of it, the way a very large number sits on top of a life, quietly, without resolving anything underneath. You go inside. Your daughter Maya is at the kitchen table. She's 13. She's working on negative exponents, and she's frustrated in the specific way of someone who is certain they're missing something obvious. She looks up when you walk in. You put your keys on the counter. You sit down across from her. She shows you the problem, and for a moment, just a moment, you are aware of the full distance between where you started and where you're sitting right now, and then you look at the problem, and you help her solve it, because that's what you do now. You are not the person standing on a chair reaching for the coffee tin. You are the person who makes sure nobody in your house ever has to.